the moment I stepped onto the cracked linoleum of the old Blackwell Hospital. I knew I was trespassing on something that was still breathing. Not with lungs, but with memory. It wasn't the smell of dust and decay that hit me first. It was the intense, almost liquid silence that pressed against my eardrums. The kind of silence that suggests everyone nearby is holding their breath. I had come for the photos, an urban explorer looking for the perfect shot, but I found myself listening for a sound that wasn't there. A sound that should have been there, the hum of old machinery, the creak of settling beams. But there was nothing, only the heavy, watchful quiet of a place that had died violently 20 years ago in rural New York State, and was now utterly unwilling to rest. My flashlight beam cut a path through the main hall, illuminating a nurse's station where the plastic telephone still sat, covered in a delicate, undisturbed shawl of cobwebs, as if waiting for a call that would never come. I'm Jake, a freelance photographer from Buffalo, and exploring derelict places is my hobby, my escape. Blackwell was legendary, not just for its architecture, but for the stories, rumors of a botched state-ordered closure back in the early 2000s that left behind more than just equipment. The building was a sprawl of late-century architecture, all concrete and tired brick, sitting on a neglected plot just outside the city limits. I'd seen hundreds of places like this, schools, factories, mansions, but Blackwell felt different. It felt like a museum of sorrow. The air was unnaturally cold, even for an autumn night, a cold that seeped into the marrow. In the maternity ward, I paused. A rocking chair, perfectly centered in the middle of a small, empty room, moved just slightly. A slow, gentle sway, back and forth, barely perceptible. It wasn't the wind. The windows were sealed shut by decades of grime, and the heavy weather outside was only a distant memory here, cut off by the thick walls. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds until it settled. The only sound, the faint, fast thumping of my own heart against my ribs. Settling, I told myself. Old wood, shifting. But the chair hadn't made a single sound as it moved, moving deeper into the hospital's guts. The unsettling feeling grew from a prickle of unease to a suffocating cloak. I found the old surgical wing. The floor was sticky, even under a thick layer of dust. The lights in my flashlight seemed to dim slightly as I walked through the operating theaters, each room colder than the last. I started noticing things that weren't logical, details that violated the physics of decay. In one recovery room, a single bed was meticulously made, the white sheet pulled taut, the pillow fluffed. Every other bed in the wing was stripped bare, the mattresses rotted through. Why was this one different? As I photographed it, a sharp, metallic temps briefly pierced the dusty air, like sterile bleach mixed with something coppery and dark. I swung my light beam toward the hallway and saw nothing. Then, in the beam's periphery, a fleeting movement at the far end of the hall. Near the fire exit, a ripple in the darkness, too quick to be shadow play, too fluid to be a rodent. I called out, a foolish move, and my voice was immediately swallowed by the depth of the hospital's silence. It didn't echo. It was just gone. From then on, I moved with an overwhelming sense of being observed, not just by the building itself, but by something deliberate and close. I started taking 2 steps for everyone, a quick, jerky pace that belied the mounting terror. I reached the basement access. The door was a heavy, rusted slab, and it was ajar by about an inch. I hadn't opened it. I definitely hadn't. I shone my light into the black void beyond, and the beam barely penetrated the gloom. The air flowing out was suddenly tropical, humid and thick, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet perfume that made my stomach clench. I heard a dragging sound from below, a slow, heavy shoo-shoos that suggested something large was being pulled across concrete. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The dragging stopped. A moment later, a single word, wet and low, seemed to emanate not from the basement, but from the air directly behind my ear. Stay. I ran. I didn't care about the shots, the reputation, or the stupid adrenaline rush. I bolted back through the main hall, past the nurse's station, my feet thudding loudly on the cracked linoleum. I didn't dare look back, but the feeling of pursuit was absolute, a cold pressure growing on the small of my back, like an invisible hand pushing me forward, only too fast. As I reached the heavy main doors, my hand fumbling with the rusted latch, I heard a drawn-out screech erupt from the floor above, a sound that was pure, unfiltered panic, not human, but mechanical and sharp, like rusty iron being forcibly torn apart. I yanked the door open and scrambled out, falling onto the damp grass, turning back just in time to see the briefest flash of white at a third-story window, a pale shape silhouetted for a fraction of a second against the blackness inside. It was a face, long and distorted, staring directly at me, its mouth a perfect horrified "Oh." I didn't stop running until I reached my truck on the main road, 5 minutes away. I drove home. The image of that face burned behind my eyelids. The next morning, I checked the photos on my camera. There were only 4. The first 3 were blurry, unusable shots of the surgical wing. The 4th was a sharp, perfect focus of the meticulously made bed in the recovery room, and on the crisp white pillow, where there had been only dust and shadow when I took the picture, was a single, fresh, dark red handprint. It was small, like a child's, and perfectly clear. I didn't go to the police. I didn't go back. I just deleted the photo, and, to this day, I can still smell that sickly sweet perfume whenever the humidity is high. The thing about the old Crestwood mining office was its location, tucked deep in the hills of northern Arizona, a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. It felt less like an abandoned building and more like the earth itself had swallowed it, then partially coughed it back up. The structure was a single-story stone block, built into the side of a defunct copper mine in the 1930s. What got me wasn't the dust or the broken glass, but the filing cabinets. Dozens of them, all standing upright in the main room, meticulously labeled, and every single drawer wide open and completely, cleanly empty. It was unnerving. Who empties a building with that kind of perverse thoroughness, yet leaves the massive, heavy furniture in place? It suggested an exit that was neither hurried nor professional, but calculated and deeply strange. I'm Maya. I document forgotten Americana for my personal archive, focusing on the relics of boom man bust cycles in the West. I'd hiked in just before sunset, intending to spend the night outside, but the office looked sturdy, and frankly, less exposed than my tent. The isolation was intense. Once the sun dropped below the horizon, the only light was my headlamp, and the only sound was the omnipresent, dry wind whispering across the valley, a sound that, out here, always manages to sound like distant, low conversation. I set up my camera gear near a grimy window, the glass opaque with the grit of decades. I noticed a small detail in the corner of the room, near a rusted water cooler. The dust pattern on the concrete floor was disrupted. It wasn't a footprint. It was a faint, clean circle, about the diameter of a large bucket, and it was too fresh. I chalked it up to an animal, or maybe a previous, sloppy visitor. But the clean perimeter of the shape kept nagging at me as night deepened. The office grew impossibly colder, and the air thickened with a smell I couldn't place, not rot, but something earthy and vaguely metallic, like freshly disturbed soil mixed with ozone. I was reviewing my initial photographs when the real strangeness began. I was near the back of the building, checking out a heavy wooden door that led to what must have been the old safe or records room. I pressed my ear to the thick, varnished wood. Nothing. I took a step back, and a piece of paper fluttered down from the ceiling rafters, landing silently at my feet. It was a ledger page, yellowed and brittle, covered in neat, looping script. The text was just an inventory list, columns of names and corresponding numbers. But the unsettling part was that the ink was still wet in a few spots, slightly smudging when I touched it. How could ink be wet on a paper that had been sitting in a dead building for over 50 years? I shone my light up to the rafters, convinced a draft must have dislodged it from a hidden nest, but the rafters were clean, thick with undisturbed cobwebs and years of desiccated dust. No one had been up there. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I folded the page and put it in my pocket, deciding to leave, but as I turned back toward the main room, I saw it. One of the filing cabinets, the heavy steel beasts, was now slightly pulled out from the wall, maybe 2 inches, forming a thin, black vertical gap. I knew, with absolute certainty, that it had been flush against the wall only minutes before. I approached it slowly, headlamp cutting through the gloom. The air around the cabinet was distinctly colder than the rest of the room. I reached out, a trembling hand, and carefully pushed the cabinet back into place. As the metal met the stone wall, I heard a faint, but clear, scratching sound emanate from inside the cabinet. Not metal on metal, but something like fingernails on the thin cardboard of a file folder, rapidly drawing nearer to the edge of the drawer. I froze, breath hitching in my throat. The scratching stopped, and for a terrifying second, there was silence. Then, a slow, single tap from the other side of the metal, directly opposite my own face. I recoiled, scrambling backward, tripping over my tripod. As I fell, the sound intensified, not the scratching, but the rhythmic, rapid thudding that now pulsed from every single empty filing cabinet in the room. It sounded like something trapped and desperate, throwing itself against the thin steel walls of its prison, a chorus of heavy, desperate impacts that seemed to accelerate in their frenzy. I scrabbled backward, trying to get to the front door, the deafening noise drowning out the wind, drowning out my own thoughts. As I reached the doorway, a low guttural moan echoed from the depths of the filing room, distinct and agonizing, followed by a heavy, wet thump against the far cabinet. I didn't wait to see if any of the drawer fronts were bending outward. I burst out the front door, the night air shocking and cold on my skin. I didn't even bother to close the door behind me. I just grabbed my pack and ran blindly toward the truck, the metallic, frantic drumming of the cabinets fading behind me, replaced by the howl of the desert wind. I drove the entire night without stopping. When I was finally on the interstate, hundreds of miles away, I pulled out the ledger page. I unfolded it, my hands shaking in the pale morning light. The ink was still dry now, fully set, but on the back of the page, scrawled messily in pencil that hadn't been there when I first picked it up, was a single, looping signature, followed by the date, yesterday's date. The name was one of the miners from the inventory list on the front. I tore the paper into pieces and threw it out the window. Now, when I hear the wind on a quiet night, it's not the distant conversation I hear. It's the muffled, hopeless thudding of steel. The most disturbing thing about the old orphanage, St. Jude's, wasn't its peeling paint or the broken windows, but the sheer number of shoes, dozens of them. Tiny leather shoes, canvas sneakers, little worn-out boots, all neatly lined up in the entryway, perfectly preserved under a thick, undisturbed layer of dust, as if the children had just stepped out for a moment and never returned. It was located deep in the redwood forests of Northern California, a grand, imposing Victorian structure that time and the wilderness had begun to reclaim. The silence inside was profound, but not empty. It was a heavy, expectant quiet, like the air just before a thunderstorm. I'm Sarah, and I run a ghost hunting blog. My followers had been clamoring for St. Jude's after local legends resurfaced tales of a matron who disappeared, and children who simply vanished one night in the 1950s. I'd driven hours, parked miles down a logging road, and hiked the rest of the way, eager for evidence of the paranormal. The building itself was a maze of narrow hallways and small, identical rooms. Each room held a single, rusted iron bed frame, no mattress, just the stark metal. The air was thick with a cloying scent, like old lavender and something subtly antiseptic, a smell that clung to the back of my throat. I set up my EMF detector in the common room, hoping for a spike, but it remained stubbornly flat. I moved from room to room, documenting the decay with my camera. In what must have been the playroom, I found a pile of wooden blocks. They weren't scattered by time. They were carefully stacked into a tall, precarious tower in the center of the room. It struck me as odd, too deliberate. As I photographed it, I felt a distinct chill, not just a drop in temperature, but a sensation like cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, but there was nothing. No draft, no open window. The scent of lavender intensified, sharp and cloying. I continued to move through the building, a growing sense of dread tightening in my chest. The feeling of being watched intensified. I swore I could hear soft, rhythmic breathing in the next room, a shallow, steady inhale and exhale. That was definitely not my own. I tried to dismiss it, attributing it to my overactive imagination, or the creaks and groans of an old building settling. But then, as I passed a classroom, I heard a faint, high-pitched giggle. It was soft, almost subliminal, but undeniably the sound of a child. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart was pounding. I waited, straining my ears, but heard nothing more. Only the oppressive silence. I decided to enter the classroom. The room was mostly bare, but on the blackboard, scrawled in chalk that looked oddly fresh, was a series of childish drawings, stick figures holding hands, a crude house, and in the corner, a figure with unusually long, spindly limbs. It was staring directly out of the drawing, its eyes just two vacant circles. Below it, in shaky, unpracticed letters, was a single word, play. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen any chalk anywhere else in the building, and the board had been completely blank when I'd first peeked into the room from the doorway an hour ago. I backed away slowly, my hand instinctively going for the pepper spray I carried for stray animals, though I knew it would be useless here. As I reached the hallway, a small, porcelain doll, previously sitting on a high shelf in the corner of the room, slowly toppled forward and fell to the floor with a soft thud. Its head snapped off, rolling eerily toward my feet, its painted eyes seeming to stare up at me from the dusty floorboards. And then, from the end of the long, dark hallway, I heard the faint, distorted melody of a music box, playing a simple, childlike tune. It was coming from the head matron's office, a room I hadn't dared to enter yet. The melody was innocent, but the way it drifted down the silent hall was utterly terrifying, hinting at something that should not be playing in an abandoned, decaying place. It sounded like it was coming from inside the office, right behind the door. The door slowly, agonizingly, began to creak open, revealing a sliver of utter blackness. I didn't need to see what was inside. The music box continued its tune, now slightly louder, and as the door opened wider, a wave of that cloying lavender scent washed over me, so potent it made my eyes water and my throat burn. It felt like a physical presence, pressing in, heavy and suffocating. I turned and ran, not bothering to look back, the haunting melody of the music box seeming to accelerate behind me, each note a tiny, invisible hand pulling at my jacket. I burst out the front door, scattering the neat rows of children's shoes as I stumbled over them, not caring about the fall. I didn't stop until I reached my truck and didn't sleep until I was back in my own bed, hundreds of miles away. The next morning, I checked my camera. All the photos were gone, replaced by a single, blurry image of the playroom blackboard. The stick figures were still there, the house still crude, but the spindly figure in the corner was now much larger, taking up half the board, and its vacant eyes had been filled in with two perfectly circular, stark white dots, staring out. I never posted to my blog again. To this day, the faintest scent of lavender sends shivers down my spine, and I still sometimes hear that childlike music box playing its innocent, terrible tune, just at the edge of hearing.